They dot the Alabama landscape, usually off the main highways, but in locations that once were bustling with activity. They stand as monuments to their builders and to a way of life that is no more. They wait patiently to tell us their stories. They are the homes of 19th-century Alabama, some painstakingly restored or maintained by loving hands, some facing slow disintegration through neglect or indifference. Nearly half of the Alabama homes listed in the 1934 Historic American Buildings Survey have been lost. The beauty and fragility of rural 19th century homes caught the eye of photographer Chip Cooper. He has collaborated with writer Harry Knopke and architectural historian Robert Gamble to produce the book Silent in the Land. The book features 60 Alabama dwellings ranging from slave cabins to elegant mansions. Each home has a unique and interesting story. Let's visit some of the homes featured in this book and hear the stories they have to tell us. This raised cottage was built in 1855 for Dr. Wooten Hardy Vickers. A Whig who opposed dissolution of the Union but believed in states' rights, Vickers wrote for literary journals, including The New Yorker. Excerpts from his diary record construction of the house that was to be named Rosewood.
March 15, 1855. Slight rains passing about. Bricklayers commenced the foundation of my house on the 13th. May 25th. Paid Mr. Harrison for the portion of my building lot, which I purchased from him, $173.75. The framing of the building is pretty well up. October 10th. Agreed with Mr. Jones to oversee next year. I'm to find him a cook and give him $500. It's a monstrous price, but I can't get a man with whom I would consider my interests safe for any less. November 3rd. Finished moving yesterday, but still have a great deal to do in the way of cleaning up around. The house, extras and all, will cost just about $4,800, which I think cheap enough for such a building. It's just about exactly to my notion. I mean the arrangement and amount of room.
Tragedy has come to Dicksonia twice in the form of fire, both times by accident, unusual and unexpected. The first fire, in 1939, quickly spread through the house from a kindling box next to a fireplace. It took just 30 minutes for the house to burn down. Rebuilt of reinforced concrete in 1939 and 40, the second structure was based on the original house and met the same fate, this time from a cigarette carelessly left in a chair. Belmont is being restored by the Alabama Historical Commission and is open for tours by appointment. This large plantation home has interesting connections to Thomas Jefferson.
Dr. Alexander Mitchell, the builder, was a personal friend of our third president, living only 13 miles from him in Louisa County, Virginia. And during the 5 years that Dr. Mitchell was building this structure, he made frequent trips back to his native state, and each and every time he would stop and converse with our president. You know, Jefferson was a great admirer of Andrea Palladio, the Italian architect of the 15th century. Almost all of his buildings are Palladian in design. That is, with a central section and matching wings on both sides, and certainly Belmont qualifies there. And of course, the federal lines of the building and the very slender, delicate columns out front, all this combines and just speaks of Jefferson. And this was one of the first great plantation houses north of Mobile in all the state. The Black Belt had their great plantations, but for the most part they were Greek Revival or built during the Greek Revival era. Not saying all of them, but a greater majority of them. While Belmont stands out as one of the earliest examples of all the great plantation houses in the state. I think it's important that we preserve these places for future generations to see how those before us lived.
The roots and philosophy of Woodlawn can be traced back to Ireland, where James Hood forged his belief that land should be used wisely. When Hood came to this country, he joined an investment group that included Andrew Jackson. The group owned large tracts of farmland in Florida and Alabama. James Hood built his house on 800 acres of land in a bend of the Tennessee River. The Hood family fled during the Civil War, and their home was used by both Confederate and Union troops. Having retained their wealth while away from Alabama, they returned after the war to restart the plantation operation. The beginnings of Steelhaven date back to 1818, but it took a modern invention to make this home complete for the Parker Steele family. Purchased along with 600 acres of farmland in the early 1950s, the house was in horrible condition, but the family decided to restore it with attention to historical detail. When their careful restoration work was completed, Mr. Steele, a traveling salesman, was reluctant to move from his familiar home in Lounsborough. Mrs. Steele lured him to the house by purchasing a television, something which the family hadn't had before, and placing it in the newly restored home. Mr. Steele agreed to move the next day. In 1987, the McMahon family donated their Cortland home to the Alabama Historical Commission. Lacking the funds itself, the commission sought private purchasers to restore the federal-style house. Ben and Barbara Wilson responded to a newspaper ad and began a 5-year restoration project.
When we first saw the house, we fell in love with it. I don't know whether the house claimed us or we claimed the house. We feel like we just caretakers of the home, and we wanted to spend the remaining years here, and we restored it. We've had a lot of help from our children. It has been something that really bonded this family together, and we hope to leave it. One of them will, in our passing, we'll take the house on and keep it up. But some of the major events that we had, the wall that's northwest corner of the house, the town people tell us that it fell away and you could hear it all over town. It was like a explosion, because it was 28 feet of wall that collapsed. I had one guy say that I had more nerve than Jesse James to tackle something of this magnitude. When you could walk through and not even use a door, just walk into the house through the wall, that was something. And the old floor was so unleveled, and you felt like you were gonna fall through. The stairs was unsafe to go up. But we started having sightseers come in, and the first thing they'd say, oh, it's gonna be beautiful when you get through with it. And they would laugh.
That happened up as near as last Christmas.
Yeah.
We had a guy deliver us a pot of flowers and walk through the house, and the house was pretty much like it is now. And he said, it's really going to be pretty when y'all get through.
Mm-hmm. We don't know when we're going to get through with it in a lot of people's mind, but we feel like it.
We're working on it.
We're still working on it.
Time is an enemy of Saunders Hall. Originally the elegant home of Turner Saunders, a Methodist minister and cotton planter, the home stands amid remote cotton fields in North Alabama as wind and water take their toll. Expensive to restore and too distant from civilization for many, Saunders Hall stands alone against time. A wealthy Alabama planter once staunchly maintained that he would not exchange his comfortable old log house for a palace. This was Thomas Holland's palace, the center of his 2,000-acre plantation. The open central hall, known as a dogtrot, caught the wind to cool the house on hot summer days. Such homes were common across Alabama, but most have lost their battle against time. The Williamson plantation is in perilous condition. The nearby family cemetery tells the story of ancestors dating to the early 1800s and of Grace Williamson's death in 1978. Her husband Cecil followed 8 years later. The house has long been empty. This Greek Revival home, raised on sturdy 6-foot brick piers, could be restored to mirror the vibrancy of the surrounding plant life, but only if restoration begins soon will the house survive. Judge Fambrough was a slave owner in the former state capital, Cahaba. His house is now a remnant of what it used to be. A Doric column which framed the portico rests on a woodpile under the house. Yet the Fambrough house is alive with stories of the past. Following the Civil War, the house was purchased by freed slave Ezekiel Arthur. The widow of Ezekiel's son, Sam, still lives in the home, as she has for the past 50 years. She recalls the stories her father-in-law told.
He said he was sold 3 times. And the 3rd time he was bought by a plantation owner from Cahaba in Monroe, Louisiana. And he's 12 years old when he come here and stayed here until they call it surrender. When the surrender was, then they got free. And most of the people moved out because flood one time, yellow fever the next time. So it just population just went. And then after then he got a chance to buy this house from Mary E. Bell. But it was Judge Frambough's place. Well, he was bought to Cahaba when he was 12 years old. And the man who bought him, he was a big plantation owner. And he bought him for the house to be with Mister to clean up. And after clean up, go downtown to the State House and make your money. Half a peck of gold, half a peck of silver, and then pennies. And I still have that bucket.
James Turner Kendall would not accept compromise in the construction of his Italian-styled villa. He began collecting the stone, lumber, glass, and other materials for his dream home in 1859, but the outbreak of the war between the states halted progress. Before the war, slaves provided the labor for building. Afterwards, as free men, they were hired to work with master craftsmen to complete the work they had begun. In the beginning, Kendall kept detailed records of his costs, but he stopped after reaching $30,000. The exact final cost, though unknown, was considerably more. This home has been maintained through 5 generations of the Kendall family. It was restored in the 1980s as a bed and breakfast inn. Before time and vandalism marred its finely crafted facade, Elm Bluff could have held its own along a fashionable residential street of Lower Manhattan. For Elm Bluff is a New York house in the Deep South. John J. Crochran came to Alabama from Staten Island to seek his fortune. His great-niece, Virginia Crochran Gildersleeve, wrote about Elm Bluff in her published memoirs.
In those days, travel was almost entirely by the river steamers, which had a habit of running on mud banks and being delayed for a day or 2 at a time. Gentlemen from the plantations for many miles around used to ride to Elm Bluff and settle down with my great-uncle for as long as might be necessary, until their steamer came along the river and carried them on down to Mobile. In the big house at Elm Bluff, there was a large library, and there, laid out on a long table, were American periodicals and many European ones. I like to know this and realize that the people who lived in Alabama in those long ago days were not cut off from the world.
Fairhope was the home of an Air Force pilot, a banker, and an Episcopal priest. Sam Westbrook was all three. When Westbrook retired from the Air Force in 1970, he moved into the Gothic Revival home built by his great-grandfather, Joseph Selden, as the nucleus of a 1,000-acre plantation. Rather than farming the land himself, Westbrook rented the land to others while he pursued a career in banking. He became quite interested in the Episcopal Church and ultimately retired from his position as a bank vice president to be ordained an Episcopal priest. He served as a pastor until his death in 1987. When restoration of the Coger House began in 1991, one wall had collapsed and there was vegetation growing inside the roof. Its owner had donated the structure to a Florence Historic Preservation Group, with the stipulation that it be restored according to strict federal guidelines and occupied as a private home. A buyer was found, and this Georgian cottage was saved. Fire destroyed the Richard Croshran house sometime after 1920. It was here that Union and Confederate troops met in April 1865 to discuss prisoner exchanges at the end of the Civil War. 4 columns keep lonely vigil, a fragile skeleton, traces of the past. A half-mile tree-lined lane leads to the cluster of buildings at Pruett Oaks. Surrounded by tall oak trees are the plantation big house, the detached kitchen, and a smokehouse. A fire set here by Union soldiers during the war between the states was quelled, saving the home, which has been in the Pruett family for 6 generations.
Well, it was a complete plantation. My grandfather had roughly around 500 slaves. And the field to the east, as you drive up the driveway, was a racetrack. All the neighbors used to come on Sunday afternoon and they'd race horses. I have lived here all my life. I was born here, my father was born here. And my grandfather bought this place in the 1850s. It was a happy home and we always entertained, and my mother loved to entertain, and the house was usually full of guests. And we enjoyed having them and we enjoyed living here. I have friends to tell me that you need to sell out and go somewhere else, but it wouldn't be home. That's the worst thing you can do for an older person is move them from where they have been accustomed to living. It's terrible. They're used to that, and you put them in a different environment and they're not happy at all. The little inconvenience doesn't bother you. And they being cold, and you stay upstairs and you put on an overcoat to come back down, go to the kitchen, it's warm, and you can't heat the whole house. It's just not practical. We heat rooms. And so often in the old places, all of the original heirs have died. And the grandchildren, not unless they've been brought up to appreciate old things, don't care anything about old things. They'd rather sell it and buy something new.
Most plantation slave quarters were hardly an attractive sight. This pair of cabins, with their steeply pitched gable roofs, reflect the relatively privileged status of slaves chosen to serve in the master's household. Following the Civil War, a federal agency known as the Freedmen's Bureau was established to administer the transition of former slaves to freedom. In June 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau of Uniontown recorded an agreement between the former slaves of this plantation and R.H. Adams.
The said Adams agrees and binds himself to allow said Negroes for the faithful performance of their labor for the remainder of the year 1865, 1/4 part of the net proceeds of the crop of corn, peas, and potatoes now growing on the plantation. The said Negroes are to be furnished their usual clothing, shoes, hats, together with fuel and medical attention. It is further agreed upon that unless said Negroes work faithfully, they forfeit all claims and interest in the aforementioned crops. Only those who work in the field or aid in carrying on the operations of the plantation shall be entitled to their share of the crop aforesaid.
Remnants of life on the move remain as they were haphazardly dropped at the McClendon house. Years of itinerant living have left their mark, evidence of a series of temporary tenants. This post-war plantation house speaks of economic changes in the South after the Civil War. They're called shotgun houses because their narrow design prompted someone to say you could shoot straight through them, front to back. Though small in size, this pair in Selma was decorated in the manner of high-style Queen Anne contemporaries. In their prime, they were located at the heart of a bustling black community known as the End.
The Inn was on Broad Street. I guess the focal point of the Inn was the Roxy Theater, which was a black movie house that we paid 10 cents to go to when I was a child. Right in that area, you had a restaurant by the name of Bruff Fields. You had Clay's Casino. You had Louise. You had Stella Brown's. This was an area where there were black businesses. And I don't know where the name of the inn came from, but everybody in Selma said, we're going on the inn. I just came from the inn. I'm going down to the inn. It was the only place that we had to go and just, like kids hang out now, this was the place where we went in the afternoons and we stood in front of Louise and we had ice cream or a Coke or something, a piece of pie, and a glass of milk. That was the extent of our activity here in Selma. I think after integration, when the theaters were integrated, the Roxy was closed. The VFW, the building where the VFW club was torn down, Bruff Fields was torn down. It just deteriorated. I think integration took away a lot of the black-owned businesses. When it happened, we were glad it happened, but it did take away something from the black community.
Like many Southern homes, the Hawley house started small and grew along with the family and family fortunes. First one wing and then another was added, yielding 2 dogtrot halls and inviting porches decorated with gingerbread trim. This home recalls a time when friends dropped by on Sunday afternoons and family relaxed on the porch swing, watching a slow-paced world go by. The rural and small-town homes of 19th century Alabama reflect the hopes and dreams of the people who built them and cared for them through the years. Each home has a story, and the stories they tell define our past and the rich heritage of the Deep South. For more information about Alabama homes, Silent in the Land by Chip Cooper, Harry Knopke, and Robert Gamble is available from CKM Press in Tuscaloosa. Historic Architecture in Alabama, a primer of styles and types, 1810 to 1930, by Robert Gamble, is published by the University of Alabama Press, also in Tuscaloosa. For more information about historic preservation in Alabama, contact the Alabama Historical Commission, 725 Monroe Street, Montgomery, Alabama, 36130.